The Emberfield rest stop, a quiet oasis on a lonely stretch of highway, was about to become the stage for an unexpected drama. When Michael Winston, a battle-hardened Marine, stopped for a quick coffee break, he had no idea he was about to face a different kind of war. As he observed a young black girl and an older white man, his finely tuned instincts screamed that something was terribly wrong. But in a world where appearances can be deceiving, how could Michael be sure? And what hidden danger was lurking beneath the surface of this seemingly ordinary rest stop scene? Let's find out. But before we dive in, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this shocking story, don't forget to subscribe. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet stretch of rural highway that cut through the heart of Emberfield. As the day slowly faded into evening, a small rest stop emerged on the horizon, a beacon of respite for weary travelers. The nondescript building stood alone against the backdrop of endless fields, its modest diner and convenience store offering a brief sanctuary from the monotony of the road. Inside the diner, the atmosphere was calm and subdued. The gentle hum of fluorescent lights mingled with the soft clinking of cutlery and the occasional murmur of conversation. Plastic booths lined the walls, their faded upholstery telling tales of countless patrons who had passed through over the years. Near the entrance, a coffee station stood at the ready, its pot half full and steaming, while a row of vending machines hummed quietly in the corner. As the door swung open, admitting a gust of cool evening air, a few heads turned to observe the newcomer. Marine soldier Michael Winston stepped inside, his eyes quickly scanning the room with the practiced efficiency of a man accustomed to assessing his surroundings. Despite being back on American soil, the habits ingrained by his military training were not easily shed. Michael's gaze swept over the sparse crowd, a couple of truckers hunched over steaming mugs of coffee, an elderly woman nibbling on a piece of pie, and a middle-aged man in a suit absorbed in his newspaper. It was then that his attention was drawn to a small figure, seated in a yellow booth by the window. A young girl, no more than 8 years old, sat across from the man in the suit. Her dark skin contrasted sharply with the bright red dress she wore, and her curly hair framed a face that seemed lost in thought. There was something about her demeanor that gave Michael pause. Her wide eyes darted nervously around the room, never settling on any one thing for too long. Her small hands fidgeted in her lap, occasionally rising to press against her face as if trying to hide from some unseen threat. The man seated across from her appeared to be in his early 50s, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed, his navy blue suit crisp and well-tailored. He held his newspaper up, creating a barrier between himself and the girl. But Michael noticed how the man's eyes would periodically peer over the top of the paper, watching the child with an intensity that seemed out of place. As Michael made his way to the counter to order a coffee, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The stark difference in age and race between the man and the girl could have a perfectly innocent explanation, he reminded himself. Perhaps she was adopted, or he was a family friend. Yet the girl's apparent discomfort and the man's overly controlled demeanor nagged at him. Shaking off his unease, Michael focused on the task at hand. He was here for a quick break, a chance to recharge before continuing his long drive. As he waited for his coffee, he found his gaze drawn back to the odd pair by the window. The girl's eyes briefly met his, and in that fleeting moment, Michael felt a chill run down his spine. There was a depth of emotion in those young eyes that spoke of something beyond mere shyness or fatigue. As the waitress handed him his steaming cup of coffee, Michael decided to position himself near the vending machines. It was a strategic spot, allowing him to observe the diner without drawing attention to himself. He leaned against the wall, sipping his coffee slowly, his mind wrestling with the scene before him. The girl's fingers drummed a silent rhythm on the tabletop, her feet swinging beneath her seat, unable to reach the floor. Every so often, she would glance up at the man, quickly averting her gaze when she found him watching her. The man, for his part, maintained an air of calm detachment, his eyes moving between his newspaper and the child with practiced nonchalance. Michael's military training had honed his instincts, teaching him to trust his gut when something felt off. And right now, every fiber of his being was telling him that this situation warranted closer observation. As he stood there, caught between the desire to intervene and the fear of overreacting, Michael couldn't help but wonder about the story behind this strange tableau. Who were these people? What had brought them to this quiet rest stop on a lonely stretch of highway? And most importantly, was the girl truly safe? As the minutes ticked by, Michael found himself unable to shake the growing sense of unease that had taken root in his chest. He knew he couldn't leave, not yet, not until he was certain that his concerns were unfounded. And so, he settled in for a longer stay, his coffee cooling in his hand as he kept a watchful eye on the curious pair by the window. The quiet hum of conversation in the diner provided a backdrop to Michael's thoughts as he continued his vigilant observation. He had long since finished his coffee, but he lingered, unable to shake the feeling that something was amiss. His eyes kept being drawn back to the girl in the red dress and the man in the navy suit. As Michael watched, he noticed the girl's hand move in an odd gesture. She raised it slightly, palm facing outward, fingers spread wide. The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it caught Michael's attention immediately. His brow furrowed as he tried to decipher the meaning behind the gesture. Was it a nervous tic, a habit born of boredom, or was it something more? The girl's eyes darted around the room nervously before briefly meeting Michael's gaze. In that fleeting moment, he saw a flicker of something in her expression: fear, desperation. It was gone as quickly as it had appeared, but it left Michael with a growing sense of unease. His military training kicked in, his mind racing through possibilities. The hand gesture nagged at him. It seemed intentional, deliberate. Could it be a distress signal? He'd seen similar gestures used in high-stress situations, a silent plea for help when words were too dangerous to speak. Michael's pulse quickened as he considered the implications. If the girl was indeed trying to signal for help, what exactly was she afraid of? The man across from her seemed calm, composed, his attention apparently focused on his newspaper. But there was something about the way he watched the girl, his gaze too controlled, too intent, that set Michael's nerves on edge. He tried to rationalize the situation. This wasn't a battlefield, it was a quiet diner at a rest stop. The girl could simply be shy, uncomfortable around strangers. The man could be a family friend, or even a relative, despite their different races. Michael didn't want to jump to conclusions, but his instincts, honed by years of military service, were screaming at him that something was wrong. The tension in Michael's body grew as he continued to observe. He noticed how the girl seemed to shrink into herself whenever the man's gaze fell upon her. Her movements were stiff, controlled, as if she were trying to make herself as small and unnoticeable as possible. It was a far cry from the natural exuberance one would expect from a child her age. The man, for his part, maintained his facade of normalcy. He sipped his coffee, turned the pages of his newspaper, and occasionally made what appeared to be casual conversation with the girl. But Michael couldn't shake the feeling that it was all an act, a carefully constructed veneer of normalcy hiding something far more sinister. As the minutes ticked by, Michael found himself caught in an internal struggle. Should he approach them? Ask if everything was all right? But what if he was wrong? What if this was all a misunderstanding, and he ended up causing unnecessary distress? The weight of the decision pressed down on him, his military training urging him to act, while his civilian sensibilities cautioned restraint. He decided to wait, to watch a little longer. If the girl made the hand signal again, if he saw any clear signs of distress, then he would intervene. Until then, he would remain vigilant, ready to act at a moment's notice. As he stood there, poised on the knife's edge between action and inaction, Michael couldn't help but reflect on the strange turns life could take. Just days ago, he had been in a war zone, facing clear and present dangers. Now, back on American soil, he found himself embroiled in a different kind of conflict, one where the lines between right and wrong, action and overreaction, were frustratingly blurred. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours as Michael maintained his vigilant watch. The initial burst of adrenaline had faded, replaced by a steady, humming tension that thrummed through his body. He knew he couldn't stand there forever, coffee cup long since emptied, without drawing suspicion. Deciding to take action, even if only to justify his continued presence in the diner, Michael made his way to the counter. "I'll take a sandwich and some snacks for the road," he said to the waitress, his voice low and controlled. As she bustled off to prepare his order, Michael allowed his gaze to drift back to the girl and the man. This time, however, the scene had shifted. The girl's demeanor had changed subtly. Her hands were still resting on the table. Her eyes were downcast, no longer darting around the room. Most notably, she didn't make the hand signal that had so caught Michael's attention earlier. Michael's brow furrowed as he watched the man lean in slightly, murmuring something to the girl under his breath. The words were too quiet for Michael to hear, but their effect on the girl was immediate and unmistakable. Her small frame tensed, her shoulders hunching as if trying to make herself even smaller. The man's eyes never left the girl, his gaze intense and possessive. There was something in that look that made Michael's skin crawl, a predatory gleam that seemed at odds with the man's outwardly calm demeanor. As the waitress returned with his food, Michael found himself second-guessing his earlier suspicions. Maybe he was overthinking things. Maybe his years in the military had left him paranoid, seeing threats where none existed. After all, this was a public place, a simple diner off the highway. Surely nothing truly nefarious could be happening right here, in plain sight. He tried to shake off the gnawing feeling in his gut, telling himself it was probably nothing. Just a family having a quiet meal. The girl was probably just shy, uncomfortable around strangers. The man's controlling presence could be explained away as parental concern, couldn't it? But even as he tried to rationalize the situation, Michael couldn't fully convince himself. The memory of the girl's earlier distress signal, the fear he'd glimpsed in her eyes, the unnatural stillness of her posture now, it all added up to a picture that he couldn't ignore no matter how much he wanted to. As he gathered his food, preparing to leave, Michael found himself torn. His instincts were screaming at him that something was wrong, that the girl needed help. But doubt clouded his judgment. What if he was wrong? What if he caused a scene over nothing? The weight of indecision pressed down on him as he stood there, sandwich in hand, caught between his desire to help and his fear of overstepping. He knew he should leave, continue on his journey. He had places to be, after all. But something kept him rooted to the spot, unable to turn his back on the nagging feeling that he was witnessing something deeply wrong. As he wrestled with his thoughts, Michael's eyes were drawn once more to the girl. She sat there, small and vulnerable, a bright splash of red in the dull interior of the diner. Despite her stillness, there was a tension in her body that spoke volumes. It was the posture of someone expecting the worst, braced for a blow that could come at any moment. The man, for his part, seemed oblivious to Michael's scrutiny. He continued to sip his coffee, rustle his newspaper, and occasionally glance at the girl with that same unsettling intensity. To any casual observer, they might have looked like any other mismatched pair, a guardian and his ward perhaps, or a family friend tasked with looking after a shy child. But Michael wasn't a casual observer. His training had taught him to look beyond the surface, to see the subtle signs that others might miss, and everything he saw told him that this situation was far from normal. As he stood there, food in hand, Michael knew he was at a crossroads. He could walk away, convince himself that he was imagining things, that his combat-honed instincts were misfiring in this peaceful setting, or he could stay, continue to watch, and be ready to act if his suspicions proved correct. The decision weighed heavily on him. He knew that if he left now, if he turned his back on this situation, he might never forgive himself if something happened to that little girl. But if he stayed, if he involved himself in what might be a perfectly innocent situation, he risked causing unnecessary trouble and embarrassment. In the end, it wasn't really a choice at all. Michael knew he couldn't leave, not yet. Not until he was absolutely certain that the girl was safe. He might be overreacting, might be seeing shadows where none existed, but he'd rather face the embarrassment of being wrong than live with the guilt of having done nothing if he was right. As he moved towards the exit, his steps slow and measured, Michael kept his senses alert. He wasn't leaving, not really. He was simply repositioning himself, preparing for whatever might come next in this increasingly unsettling encounter. Michael's hand closed around the door handle, the cool metal a stark contrast to the warmth of the diner. He paused, his body half turned towards the exit, caught in that liminal space between staying and going. Something compelled him to take one last look, to cast a final glance over his shoulder at the girl in the red dress. In that moment, time seemed to slow. The girl's hand rose, palm facing outward, fingers spread wide. It was the same gesture he had noticed earlier, but this time there was no mistaking its intent. Her eyes, wide and filled with a desperation that no child should know, locked onto his. In that split second of connection, Michael saw a silent plea, a cry for help that couldn't be ignored. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't just a shy girl having lunch with her father. There was something darker at play here, something that chilled Michael to his core. He saw it clearly now, the fear in her eyes, the tension in her small frame, the silent desperation in her gesture. This was a cry for help, and it was real. In that moment, all of Michael's doubts and hesitations evaporated. His military training kicked in, his mind shifting into high alert. He couldn't walk away now, couldn't pretend he hadn't seen what he'd seen. The girl needed help, and he was perhaps the only one in a position to provide it. Time snapped back into its normal flow. Michael released the door handle, his decision made. He turned back towards the diner, his posture straightening, his jaw set with determination. He may have left the battlefield behind, but the instinct to protect, to stand up for those who couldn't defend themselves, was deeply ingrained in his being. As he strode back into the diner, Michael's mind raced, considering his options. He couldn't simply grab the girl and run. That would cause chaos and potentially put her in more danger. He needed to approach this carefully, to assess the situation more closely before taking action. His eyes never left the girl as he moved, watching for any sign of immediate danger. The man across from her seemed oblivious to the silent exchange that had just taken place, his attention still focused on his newspaper, but there was a tension in his shoulders, a stillness that spoke of barely contained violence. Michael's heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline surging through his veins. He knew he was walking into a potentially dangerous situation, but he couldn't turn back now. The memory of the girl's pleading eyes, the desperation in her silent gesture, steeled his resolve. Whatever was happening here, he was now committed to seeing it through. As Michael approached the table, he could see the girl's eyes widen in a mixture of hope and fear. The man, sensing movement, looked up from his newspaper. For a brief moment, surprise flashed across his face before he schooled his features into a mask of polite inquiry. Michael's mind raced, searching for the right words, the right approach. He knew he had to be careful. One wrong move could escalate the situation, potentially putting the girl in even more danger. But he also knew he couldn't hesitate. Every instinct he had, honed through years of military service, was screaming at him that this child needed help, and she needed it now. With measured steps, Michael closed the distance to the table. His posture was relaxed but alert, projecting a calm authority that belied the tension coiling in his muscles. He stood over Greg and Zoe, his presence commanding but non-threatening. Greg's eyes widened briefly, a flicker of shock crossing his face before he regained his composure. The sudden approach of the soldier had clearly caught him off guard, disrupting whatever plans he might have had. Michael's gaze flicked between Greg and Zoe, reading their reactions. The contrast was stark, Greg's face a mask of forced casualness, while Zoe seemed to shrink further into herself, her eyes darting nervously between the two men. "Is everything okay here?" Michael asked, his voice steady and direct. He aimed the question more at Zoe than at Greg, but he kept both of them in his peripheral vision, alert for any sudden movements. Greg was the first to respond, his voice smooth and friendly, though there was an undercurrent of tension that he couldn't quite hide. "Yes, everything's fine," he said, his tone light but his eyes wary. "We're just stopping by and taking a break. Why, is there any problem, soldier?" The question carried a subtle challenge, an attempt to gauge whether Michael suspected anything. But Michael wasn't so easily deterred. His attention shifted fully to Zoe, his posture softening slightly as he addressed her directly. Bending down to meet her eye level, Michael asked gently but firmly, "Is this true?" His eyes searched her expression, looking for any sign that might confirm or allay his suspicions. Zoe hesitated, her eyes flicking nervously between Greg and Michael. For a moment she seemed frozen, caught between fear and the desperate hope for rescue. Then, after a quick glance at Greg, she nodded slowly, her movements stiff and robotic. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but the hesitation in her response only served to confirm Michael's unease. Michael nodded slightly, stepping back. To all appearances, he seemed satisfied with the answer. He turned and walked toward the door, giving the impression that he was about to leave the diner. As he moved away, Greg called after him, his voice overly cheerful, trying to maintain the facade of normalcy. "Thanks for your service," he said with a polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. But Michael wasn't fooled. As he headed toward the exit, his instincts were sharper than ever. The girl's hesitation, the forced nature of her nod, the controlled environment Greg had created, everything told him that his initial suspicions were correct. Zoe needed help, and his earlier doubt had transformed into grim determination. Michael pushed open the door of the diner, stepping out into the cool evening air. The parking lot was quiet, a few cars scattered across the asphalt, their surfaces reflecting the dim glow of the overhead lights. He walked purposefully towards his own vehicle, his movements casual and unhurried to any observer. But Michael was far from casual. His every sense was on high alert, his mind racing with the implications of what he had just witnessed. As he reached his car, he didn't get in. Instead, he positioned himself where he could keep a clear view of the diner's exit. His military training had taught him the value of strategic positioning, and he wasn't about to lose sight of Greg and Zoe now. With swift, practiced movements, Michael pulled out his phone. His fingers flew over the keypad as he dialed 911, his eyes never leaving the diner's entrance. When the operator answered, his voice was low and urgent. "I need to report a possible child abduction," he said, his words clipped and precise. "I'm at the Emberfield rest stop off Highway 27. There's a young black girl about 8 years old wearing a red dress. She's with an older white man, early 50s, in a navy suit. The girl seems distressed and may have tried to signal for help." He provided a detailed description of both Zoe and Greg, emphasizing the girl's apparent fear and the man's controlling behavior. "I'm a former Marine," he added, hoping it would lend credibility to his report. "Something's not right here. This girl needs help." As he spoke, Michael's eyes remained fixed on the diner's exit. He was acutely aware that Greg might decide to leave at any moment, especially if he suspected that Michael's interest was more than casual concern. Every muscle in Michael's body was tense, ready to spring into action if necessary. The operator assured him that police were on their way, urging him to stay safe and not to intervene directly unless the child was in immediate danger. Michael acknowledged the instruction, but inwardly, he knew he would do whatever was necessary to keep Zoe safe. As he ended the call, Michael settled into a watchful waiting. The minutes seemed to crawl by, each second stretching into eternity. He found himself holding his breath, straining to catch any movement from inside the diner, and then he saw it. Through the large windows, he could make out Greg rising from his seat, reaching for his jacket. Zoe remained seated, her small form almost swallowed by the booth. Michael's heart rate spiked as he watched Greg lean over, roughly grabbing Zoe's arm and pulling her to her feet. Just as Michael was about to abandon caution and rush back into the diner, he heard the welcome sound of sirens in the distance. Relief washed over him as he saw 2 police cars pulling into the rest stop parking lot, their lights flashing. Without hesitation, Michael sprinted towards the diner. The police officers closed behind him. As they burst through the doors, Michael's eyes immediately locked onto Greg and Zoe. Greg had been in the process of dragging Zoe towards the exit, but at the sight of Michael and the uniformed officers, he froze. The color drained from Greg's face, his confident facade crumbling in an instant. Panic replaced the controlled demeanor he had maintained earlier. Zoe's eyes widened, a mixture of fear and hope flashing across her face as Greg's grip on her arm tightened reflexively. In that moment, as the diner erupted into chaos, Michael knew that the real confrontation was just beginning. The next few minutes would determine Zoe's fate, and he was prepared to do whatever it took to ensure her safety. The diner, once a place of quiet routine, had transformed into a scene of tense confrontation. The few patrons present watched in stunned silence as the drama unfolded before them. The air crackled with tension, all eyes focused on the tableau near the exit. Greg, his face a mask of barely contained panic. Zoe, frozen in place, her small frame trembling. And Michael standing shoulder to shoulder with the police officers, his posture radiating determination. "Sir, let go of the girl and step back," one of the officers commanded, his voice firm but measured. The authority in his tone left no room for argument, but Greg seemed paralyzed, his grip on Zoe's arm tightening reflexively. For a moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the soft whimper that escaped Zoe's lips, a sound that tore at Michael's heart. He watched Greg closely, ready to intervene if the man made any sudden moves. Finally, Greg's paralysis broke. "This is a misunderstanding," he stammered, his voice cracking as he released Zoe's arm and tried to backtrack. "She's my niece. We were just leaving, that's all." His eyes flicked between Michael and the officers, searching desperately for an escape route that didn't exist. Michael could see the fear in Greg's eyes, the realization that he had been caught. But more importantly, he saw Zoe. The little girl stood rooted to the spot, trembling, her eyes darting between Greg and Michael. She looked on the verge of tears, caught between the fear of her captor and the uncertainty of what would happen next. One of the officers moved closer to Greg, his hand resting cautiously on his holster. "Sir, we need to ask you a few questions," he said, his tone calm but commanding. "We've received reports of suspicious behavior, and we need to verify your relationship with the child." As the officers began to question Greg, Michael's focus remained on Zoe. He took a small step forward, trying to position himself between her and Greg without alarming her further. "You're safe now," he said softly, his voice low but firm. Zoe looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. Greg's composure continued to crumble as the officers pressed him for details. He fumbled over his words, unable to provide any concrete proof of his claimed relationship to Zoe. With each passing moment, his story became less coherent, his desperation more evident. Michael watched as the officers exchanged glances, their suspicions clearly growing. He knew they were building towards a decision, weighing the evidence before them against Greg's increasingly implausible explanations. Throughout it all, Zoe remained silent, her small frame rigid with tension. Michael longed to comfort her, to assure her that everything would be okay, but he knew that right now the best thing he could do was to ensure that Greg was properly dealt with. As the questioning continued, the officers' suspicions clearly grew. They exchanged glances, their body language shifting subtly as they moved to fully control the situation. Greg's eyes darted around the diner, as if searching for an escape route, but he was cornered, trapped by his own actions and the consequences that were rapidly closing in around him. Finally, one of the officers gently approached Zoe, kneeling down to her level. "Sweetheart," he said softly, "can you tell us who this man is to you? Are you okay?" Zoe's voice trembled as she finally dared to speak. "I need help," she whispered, her small frame shaking. "I'm in danger." The words seemed to cost her greatly, each one a battle against her fear. The admission hung in the air, heavy with implication. The officers exchanged glances, their decision made. With Zoe's admission and Greg's inability to prove any legal connection to her, they moved to make the arrest. "Sir, you're under arrest," one officer declared, moving to handcuff Greg. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Greg's protests grew louder as the reality of his situation set in. "This is a mistake, you don't understand," he shouted, but his words fell on deaf ears. The officers led him out of the diner, his cries fading as they put him in the back of a police car. Inside the diner, Zoe stood alone, visibly relieved but still scared. Michael remained nearby, a steady presence amidst the chaos. As the officers began to gently question Zoe, Michael knew that this was just the beginning. There would be questions to answer, statements to give, a long process ahead to ensure justice was served. But for now, in this moment, he allowed himself to feel a sense of relief. The girl was safe. Whatever Greg's intentions had been, whatever danger Zoe had faced, it had been averted. As he watched the officers comfort Zoe, Michael knew that his decision to trust his instincts, to act when others might have walked away, had made all the difference. The diner, once a scene of tense confrontation, had quieted. The few remaining patrons whispered among themselves, casting furtive glances at Zoe and the officers. Outside, the flashing lights of the police cars painted the parking lot in alternating hues of red and blue. Inside one of those cars, Greg sat handcuffed, his earlier bravado completely shattered. Through the window, Michael could see him gesticulating wildly, his mouth moving in what appeared to be a stream of desperate explanations or pleas, but whatever he was saying fell on deaf ears. The officers had made their decision, and Greg was going to the station. Back in the diner, the focus had shifted entirely to Zoe. She sat in one of the booths, a kind-faced female officer beside her. The woman spoke softly, her words too low for Michael to hear, but he could see Zoe's tense posture beginning to relax ever so slightly. As Michael watched, one of the male officers approached him. "Sir," he said, his tone respectful, "we're going to need a statement from you. Can you tell us exactly what you saw that made you suspicious?" Michael nodded, his military training kicking in as he gave a concise, detailed account of everything he had observed. He described the hand signals, the girl's obvious distress, the man's controlling behavior. As he spoke, he could see the officer's expression growing grimmer. "You did the right thing calling us," the officer said when Michael had finished. "Too many people would have looked the other way, convinced themselves it was nothing. You may well have saved that little girl's life." The words hit Michael hard. He had acted on instinct, driven by a sense that something was wrong. But hearing the officer put it so starkly that he might have saved a life brought the gravity of the situation into sharp focus. Michael swallowed hard, nodding his acknowledgement. As the officer moved away to confer with his colleagues, Michael's attention was drawn back to Zoe. The girl looked small and vulnerable in the large booth, her bright red dress a stark contrast to the muted colors of the diner. Despite the gentle demeanor of the female officer beside her, Zoe's eyes kept darting around the room, as if expecting Greg to reappear at any moment. One of the officers gently questioned Zoe, who was still visibly shaken. Her voice trembled, but she finally dared to speak. "I want my dad," she whispered, her small frame trembling. "I'm scared." The officers exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of sympathy and determination. With Greg's arrest and Zoe's admission, the officers made the decision to take everyone to the police station. They needed to sort out the details, contact Zoe's real family, and ensure the girl's safety. As they prepared to leave the diner, Michael felt a hand on his shoulder. It was one of the officers. "Sir, we'd appreciate it if you could come down to the station as well. We'll need a formal statement and, well, you seem to have a calming effect on the girl." Michael nodded, his eyes moving to Zoe. She was watching him, her expression a mixture of fear and hope. He offered her a reassuring smile, and she seemed to relax just a fraction. As they all filed out of the diner, Zoe with the female officer and Michael following behind, the gravity of the situation settled over them. What had started as a suspicious scene in a highway diner had unraveled into something far more serious. And as they drove towards the police station, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that this night was far from over. The fluorescent lights of the police station cast a harsh glow over the bustling room. Officers moved about with purpose, their voices a low murmur punctuated by the occasional ring of a phone or the clack of computer keys. In one corner, Greg sat handcuffed to a chair, his once confident demeanor now completely shattered. As the officers processed Greg, the gravity of the situation began to unfold. They dug deeper into his background, searching for any clues that might shed light on his relationship with Zoe. Greg, still pleading his case, insisted that he was Zoe's father. "I'm her father," he yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. "You've got this all wrong." But his pleas fell on deaf ears as the officers continued their investigation. Hours passed, filled with background checks and intense questioning. The atmosphere in the station grew increasingly tense as the truth began to emerge. It started with small inconsistencies in Greg's story, details that didn't quite add up. But as the officers dug deeper, a shocking reality came to light. Greg wasn't Zoe's biological father. He was her stepfather, the new husband of Zoe's mother. The revelation sent shockwaves through the station. Greg had no legal authority over Zoe, no right to have taken her from her school earlier that day. But the horror of the situation didn't stop there. As the officers continued their investigation, they uncovered an even more disturbing truth. Zoe's mother had lost custody of her daughter months ago, after a bitter court battle. Zoe's biological father had been awarded full custody, a fact that Greg had conveniently omitted from his earlier statements. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, revealing a picture far more sinister than anyone had initially imagined. Greg, acting in concert with Zoe's mother, had effectively kidnapped the young girl from her daycare. Their plan, as evidenced by documents found in Greg's possession, was to flee the country with Zoe, evading the court's custody decision and disappearing with the child. The realization of how close Zoe had come to being taken away, potentially never to be seen again, sent a chill through everyone involved in the case. The officers' faces grew grim as they processed the magnitude of what they had prevented. As this information came to light, the door to the station swung open with a bang. A man rushed in, his face a mixture of worry and relief. It was Zoe's biological father, the one who had been awarded full custody. He hadn't known anything about the kidnapping. He usually picked Zoe up after work, but today he had received a call from the police that had turned his world upside down. The father's eyes scanned the room frantically until they landed on Zoe, who was sitting in a chair near one of the desks, looking small and lost. "Zoe!" he cried out, his voice cracking with emotion. Zoe's head snapped up, her eyes widening with recognition and relief. "Daddy!" she exclaimed, leaping from her chair and running towards him. The father dropped to his knees, gathering Zoe into his arms. Tears filled his eyes as he held her tight, whispering reassurances. "I've got you now. You're safe," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Zoe clung to him, her small hands clutching his shirt, tears streaming down her face. Michael, who had been giving his statement to one of the officers, stepped back to give the reunited family some space. He watched as Zoe buried her face in her father's chest, her small body shaking with sobs, not of fear now, but of relief. As the emotional reunion unfolded, Greg was led away to a holding cell, his protests having turned to mumbled pleas for leniency. The reality of his situation had finally sunk in, and the weight of his actions seemed to crush what little fight he had left. The night was far from over. There would be more questions to answer, statements to give, a long process ahead to ensure justice was served. But for now, in this moment, the sight of Zoe safe in her father's arms brought a sense of closure to the harrowing events of the evening. Michael felt a profound sense of relief wash over him. Seeing Zoe reunited with her real father, safe and protected, confirmed that he had made the right choice in trusting his instincts. As he stood there taking in the scene, he couldn't help but reflect on the strange turns life could take. He had stopped at that diner for a simple cup of coffee, never imagining he would become embroiled in such a dramatic and potentially tragic situation. Yet here he was, having played a crucial role in reuniting a father and daughter and preventing a terrible crime. As the night wore on and the adrenaline began to fade, Michael knew that this experience would stay with him for a long time. It was a stark reminder that sometimes the most important battles we fight aren't on foreign soil, but right here at home, in the quiet moments when we choose to act instead of looking away. As the night wore on at the police station, the initial chaos gave way to a more organized process. Michael had spent hours giving his detailed statement, recounting every observation and action from that fateful evening at the rest stop. The officers had been thorough, asking him to clarify points and provide as much detail as possible. Meanwhile, Zoe had been gently questioned by a child specialist, her father by her side for support. The girl's testimony, though brief, had corroborated Michael's account and provided crucial evidence against Greg and her mother. As the formal procedures were wrapping up, Michael found himself approached by Zoe's father. The man's eyes were red-rimmed from tears and exhaustion, but they shone with immense gratitude. I don't even know how to thank you," the father said, his voice cracking. "You saved my little girl. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." Michael, ever humble, shook his head. "There's no need to thank me," he replied, his tone sincere. "This is what I was trained to do. Whether in service or out, it's about protecting people, especially children. I couldn't just look away." But the father wasn't satisfied with this response. The enormity of what Michael had done for his family was too great to let go unacknowledged. "I need to repay you for this," he insisted, his voice filled with sincerity. "You saved my daughter's life and I owe you everything. I don't care what it takes, I want to do something for you." Michael, uncomfortable with the praise, tried to deflect. "I did what anyone should do in that situation. You don't owe me anything," he said, attempting to downplay his role. However, the father was determined. His gratitude was a force that couldn't be easily dismissed. "At least let me invite you to a barbecue," he said, a small smile breaking through his emotional state. "Come to our place this weekend. You're practically family now." His expression grew serious again. "Plus, I need to tell you about Zoe's mother and why it was so crucial that you were there at the rest stop in that moment. There's more to this story than you know." Despite Michael's initial hesitation, the father's persistence and the promise of answers made him reconsider. "All right," Michael finally conceded, a slight smile tugging at his lips. "I'll come." The father's face lit up at Michael's acceptance. It was a small thing, perhaps, in the grand scheme of what had transpired, but it represented something more, a connection forged through crisis, a bond of gratitude that transcended the usual boundaries between strangers. As they were about to leave, there was a commotion in the hallway. Greg was being led from the interrogation room to a temporary holding cell. As he passed through the main area, his eyes met those of Zoe's father. The atmosphere in the room immediately tensed. Keeping his composure for Zoe's sake, who was asleep in a chair nearby, the father walked a little closer to Greg. When he spoke, his voice was low and controlled, but filled with an unmistakable intensity. "You and her," he said, referring to Zoe's mother, "won't get away with this." Greg, pale and defeated, said nothing. His once confident demeanor had crumbled completely under the weight of his actions. The father continued, his tone cold but purposeful. "You thought you could steal her from me, but you're wrong. There's going to be a legal battle, and I'm going to make sure you both get what's coming. She's my daughter, and you won't hurt her again." Greg remained silent, the full impact of his actions and their consequences finally sinking in. He knew that the father wouldn't stop until justice was served, and the realization seemed to drain what little fight he had left. Without waiting for a response, the father turned away, returning to where Zoe slept. His demeanor softened immediately as he approached his daughter, not letting any of the anger he felt towards Greg show in his interactions with her. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the station windows, Michael prepared to leave. He exchanged contact information with Zoe's father, promising to be there for the barbecue. As he walked out of the police station, Michael couldn't help but wonder about the story behind Zoe's mother. about the circumstances that had led to this desperate attempt to take Zoe. He knew that in a few days' time, at a backyard barbecue, he would learn the rest of the story that had brought them all together on that fateful night at the rest stop. The sun hung high in the sky, casting a warm glow over the backyard of Zoe's father's house. The air was filled with the tantalizing aroma of grilling meat, mingling with the sound of laughter and conversation. It was a scene of normalcy that stood in stark contrast to the events of a few days ago. Michael found himself standing near the grill, a cold drink in his hand, surrounded by a small gathering of family and friends. Despite the festive atmosphere, he couldn't help but feel a bit out of place, a stranger among people bound by shared history and familial ties. As he scanned the yard, his eyes fell on Zoe. The little girl was playing with some other children, her laughter ringing out across the lawn. It was a far cry from the frightened child he had encountered at the rest stop, and the sight brought a smile to Michael's face. "It's good to see her like this, isn't it?" Michael turned to find Zoe's father standing beside him, a wistful smile on his face as he watched his daughter play. "It is," Michael agreed, his voice soft. "She seems happy." The father nodded, his expression growing serious. "You know," he began, his voice low and thoughtful, "I never imagined we'd end up in a situation like this. Life can take such unexpected turns." He paused, shaking his head. "I'm just grateful you were there that night. There's so much more to this story that I need to tell you." Michael listened intently as the father continued, his curiosity piqued by the man's words. The two men moved to a quieter corner of the yard, away from the festive atmosphere. "There's something you should know," the father said quietly, glancing towards the house where Zoe was now helping to clean up, "about why what happened at the rest stop was so crucial." He explained the bitter custody battle, the concerns about the mother's stability, and the court's decision to grant him full custody. "She didn't take it well," he said, shaking his head. "There were threats, but I never thought she'd actually try to take Zoe." The father's voice dropped even lower. "The police found evidence that they were planning to leave the country, if they had made it out." He couldn't finish the sentence, the pain of what might have been evident in his eyes. Michael felt a chill run down his spine as he realized just how close it had been. His decision to act, to trust his instincts, had truly changed the course of Zoe's life. The father took a deep breath, turning to face Michael fully. His eyes were filled with emotion as he spoke. "I'll thank God every day for you being there that day. Who knows what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in? She might have been gone, and I'd never have seen her again." His voice cracked slightly, and he raised his glass toward Michael. "You didn't just stop a crime. You saved my little girl. I can't repay that." Michael, always humble, nodded slowly. "I did what anyone should have done," he said, but the weight of the father's words settled in. He knew how close it had come to something far worse, and he was glad his instincts had pushed him to act. The barbecue continued into the late afternoon, and Michael found himself no longer feeling like just a guest. He had become part of something. He'd found a connection with a family that he didn't expect. The father clinked his glass with Michael's again, and for the first time in a long while, Michael felt truly at peace. Good food, laughter, and the warmth of newfound friendship filled the hours. Zoe ran over to them holding her ball. "Look what I can do," she said, smiling shyly at Michael, before tossing the ball into the air and catching it. The lightness of her smile was a reminder that things were finally normal again. Safe. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, Michael realized that his impulsive decision to intervene at that rest stop had led to more than just averting a tragedy. It had opened a door to human connection, to being part of something larger than himself. Preparing to leave, Michael said his goodbyes to Zoe and her father. He felt a sense of closure. The nightmare at the rest stop was behind them, and in its place, a new chapter had begun. He knew that the road ahead for Zoe and her father wouldn't always be easy, but he also knew that they had the strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Michael walked to his car, glancing back at the house one last time. He saw Zoe waving from the porch, her father's hand on her shoulder. It was an image of safety, of family, of home. Although he was leaving, Michael knew that he would always be connected to this family in some small way. As he drove away, the events of the past few days replayed in his mind. From a suspicious scene at a highway rest stop to a backyard barbecue, it had been an unexpected journey. But it had also been a powerful reminder of the difference one person can make, of the importance of trusting one's instincts, and of the unexpected ways in which lives can intersect and change each other for the better. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey of courage and unexpected heroism. If this story of stepping in to help someone in need touched your heart as much as it did ours, I've handpicked another inspiring tale I know you'll love. Please don't miss it. Click here to watch it next.